I would like to welcome Scott DiMauro this afternoon. Scott is currently serving in his first term as the president of the OEA. He previously served for 6 years as our OEA vice president. Scott is a high school social studies teacher from Worthington, and throughout his career, he has worked to provide students with the critical thinking and decision-making skills they need to be successful in our democratic society. He advocates daily for students, educators, and strong public schools at all levels of the OEA. I know you will see evidence in Scott's presentation this evening regarding his priorities as the president. He advocates to strengthen our locals, enhance professional supports for all of our members, and elevate the voice of educators in public policy issues throughout our state. So welcome, Scott.
Thank you very much, Mary Alice. Thank you.
I just muted him.
You just muted yourself,
you've been
Scott.
muted.
You muted yourself, Scott.
I did. I was actually sorry about that. You'd think that this is my first ever Zoom meeting, but apparently it's not. No, it's good to see so many of you familiar faces. Certainly, all of you fellow OEA members, any OEA members who are here. Great to see you. Lots of friends, but also good to see Gary, my colleague from the Central Ohio LERA organization. Gary and I are on that board together. I was, for the last 2 years, served as president of the Central Ohio chapter. And always great to have the support of Emily and Bernadette and our national organization in this. With so many educators in the room today, I am going to just start off with a big disclaimer that what I'm sharing is my perspective from a statewide level. I think each of the people on here tonight have stories to share and go a lot more in depth and really kind of validate or not some of the things that we're hearing and we're experiencing. This has been a very, very challenging year for educators across the state of Ohio and for our membership. So the opportunity to talk about some of these issues and put things that are happening with collective bargaining in our labor movements here in Ohio into some context, I think is going to be useful. But certainly for my colleagues, if you have comments, you have questions, or something that I say that you think, well, that doesn't sound quite right, let me correct the record. Please feel free to jump in and do that as we move forward. So Mary Alice's very kind introduction. And for those of you who aren't fully familiar with OEA, and almost everybody here is, for some context, keep in mind that OEA is the largest labor union in the state of Ohio. We represent approximately 120,000 members, K-12 teachers, education support professionals, people who work for county boards of PD, people who are aspiring to be educators, who are in pre-service programs, studying to be teachers, people who are retired, people who work in our state prison system, basically anybody who's got a connection to public education on the labor side. And we have a total of 750 local affiliates in all 88 counties across the state. So when we talk about some of these trends, keep in mind this is kind of bigger picture. The experience of each local is unique. The experience of each member is unique. But I think there is a lot to be learned in terms of some of these trends that we're seeing. I want to start by just talking a little bit about how the climate feels for educators this year. And, we came out of the pandemic, we came out of the earlier stages of the pandemic. Remember, March 2020, everybody had to turn on a dime, switch to remote learning because of the initial outbreak of COVID-19, with virtually no time to prepare, and with a statewide requirement that learning had to happen remotely. Was very challenging. Our members performed heroically, kept learning going through the most difficult of circumstances, and then got to the summer. And then last school year, the 2020-2021 school year, it was just constantly changing. We had some school districts that were remote for most of the year. We had some school districts that provided in-person instruction for almost the entire year. So had some locals that were in hybrid instruction. But what I think really marked last year, statewide mask requirements, no vaccines in place yet through most of last school year. And just a lot of uncertainty and a lot of like constant churn and constant change related to COVID. So heading into the summer, I think everybody expected, well, things are getting better. More vaccines are being administered. We know that as of springtime, about 90% of our membership across the state had been vaccinated. Case numbers were dropping. People expected going into this school year that it was going to be back to normal. And then the Delta variant hit, and we've seen that in many ways, this has been as stressful, if not more stressful, than the last 2 years. And that's not something that most people expected. But I was hearing people say just a few weeks into the school year in September that they were end of year tired and had barely made it into the first stages of this grading period. So what's causing all this stress? Well, a lot of it is the continued uncertainty related to COVID. While most of our members are vaccinated, until recently, students didn't have an opportunity to be vaccinated. You still have large numbers of cases cropping up, and it happens in waves. And then you have quarantines that are connected with that. You have some districts that have mask requirements in place and other districts that don't. Tremendous level of inconsistency, which creates a lot of conflict because politicians just have because this whole situation has become politicized. And so there's so much pressure now at the local level regarding decision-making related to public health issues. Layer on top of that, staff shortages like we have not seen, at least at this level, in quite some time. It is especially acute when we talk about shortages of substitute teachers. When you have a shortage of subs, that has a direct impact on the working conditions of our everyday classroom teachers, because you have people that are being expected to cover each other's classes, which then takes away time for planning and takes away time to basically just kind of take care of yourself. So that's been difficult. And then on top of that, you have real serious shortages of bus drivers, to the point that in some districts they've had to cancel school. I know that there were a couple districts just this week that didn't have staffing coming out of the Thanksgiving break to be able to open their doors as normal on Monday. You have shortages of cafeteria workers, shortages of paraprofessionals, and in a lot of places, shortages of classroom teachers and other people working in professional positions. All of that's creating a lot of strain. And I'll talk a little bit about what the dynamics are and what the numbers are when we look at membership also. We have the culture wars, attacks on honesty and education, the fact that there's been this manufactured crisis, quite frankly, regarding issues related to critical race theory, and you see people showing up at school board meetings and kind of a national narrative where there's been an effort to use race as a wedge issue, kind of drawing attention away from the need to fully and fairly fund our schools, and instead look at ways to divide communities. And unfortunately, it's coming at a time when there's increased awareness of inequities that do exist in our system. And our members have been working hard to try to make sure that every single student has access to a high quality education. So in a lot of ways, our members are feeling caught in a crossfire of these culture wars that they didn't create. And then there's kind of an underlying feeling of just being overworked and underappreciated. I think when the pandemic started, a lot of parents who had to have their children at home with them, were hailing educators as heroes. You're doing things with my kids that I could never do. take them back. I don't want them anymore. Remember all that. And a lot of that, public sentiment seemed to have shifted. And I think a lot of that has to do with politics, and a lot of this has to do with local fights over masks and vaccines and things like that. But that's just compounded the pressure and the stress that educators are feeling. And so we hear more and more stories of people considering leaving the profession. In some cases, they have done that, or retiring early and looking for opportunities to get out. Now, I will say that while anecdotally we know that there's a fair amount of truth to that, looking at the numbers in the aggregate, we have not seen a mass exodus of people from the profession. And I think that is a testament to the fact that fundamentally people went into this profession because they care about the success of kids. They're still very, very, very committed to the students that they serve. And so while it's been really stressful, most people have not been making that choice to leave, but that's something that we're watching. And then you have pressures related to all the impact of disrupted learning. We saw a spike in chronic absenteeism. We saw, even though some of the testing requirements were suspended by the state, there's still an expectation to test. And so, this ongoing pressure related to standardized testing and to, kind of meet expectations from a education reform movement that has been suspect from the beginning, that has sucked a lot of the joy out of teaching and learning in the classroom because of the obsession with standardized testing has created concerns, ongoing concerns about inequity. And then one other thing that I'll just mention is that we have seen, I think, and a lot of people here can probably attest to this with specific stories, a real increase in behavioral issues with students. And some of that, I believe strongly, is directly related to the pandemic. When we had so much shift to remote instruction and a narrowing of the curriculum to tested academic subjects, and an inability to really attend to the social and emotional needs of students, that also meant lack of socialization. We have kids who are in school now who have not had a quote unquote normal school year for the past 3 years in a row. And you think about what that means for kids in kindergarten and first grade who never had those basic socialization skills, or kids transitioning into middle school, or kids transitioning to high school. And it plays out in a lot of ways that add to a lot of stress. Some of you are familiar with Bedford High School closing through the month of November because of threats of violence, and I think that's just an indicator of that. So that's kind of the context for the situation that we're in collective bargaining. Briefly, politically, legislatively, we're always impacted by the decisions that public officials are making. We had some big wins that we were proud of. We were successful in advocating for the Fair School Funding Plan being embedded in the budget formula, although we didn't get the funding commitment from the legislature that we need, and we're continuing to advocate for that. We got some relief in terms of a path out of state takeover for East Cleveland, Youngstown, Lorraine. That's something we've been advocating for a while, but still the specter of expanded privatization, charter schools, vouchers. There's even a backpack bill that would impose universal vouchers that will create serious threats to our funding in the long run. We're happy we've got a new state report card system that will be coming out next year, moving away from punitive A to F grades. We successfully advocated for a student opportunity profile to try to put more focus on what are those components of a high quality education that districts can provide, well-rounded curriculum and reasonable class sizes and things like that. But then we're still dealing with debates around guns in schools and debates around divisive concepts and legislation that's kind of hanging over our members' heads that would really inhibit our ability of teaching an honest and truthful education to our students. So all of those things are also part of the policy context in which we find ourselves. So that's the background let's talk about some of the ways that negotiations have changed over the last couple of years as a result of all of this. And my disclaimer on this is, again, we have 750 locals. Every local is different. This is based on feedback that we've received from our field staff across the state in terms of what they see as trends. None of these are absolute, in terms of what's happening everywhere, but they are some of the things that we're seeing as far as trends, things that are different now than they were a few years ago. And a lot of you are experiencing this firsthand. For one, we are seeing that negotiations, generally speaking, seem to be more contentious and drawn out now than they have been in the recent past. We have more locals that are going to the brink of a crisis. We've had locals that have seen membership pass strike authorization votes. And we know that more locals and Mike and Jack and other people connected with FMCS can also attest to this. That we've certainly been taking full advantage of the limited resources, that are already being stretched thin from FMCS and from outside support to try to mediate some of these disputes. We have several locals, and usually, bargaining is really kind of happening heavily in the spring and summer, but in places where contracts weren't settled last spring and summer, places like Middletown and Coshocton and Zane Trace down in Ross County, Paulding in Northwest Ohio, the education support professionals in Maple Heights, East Cleveland, our DD unit, Mahoning County, Champion in Trumbull County. Those are all places that had very contentious negotiations, did ultimately end up settling without going on strike, but again, the number of crises from our perspective higher than normal. We have places like Euclid that are still not settled. Shady Side in Eastern Ohio, Madison in Richland County, Parkway in Western Ohio, Ashland Vocational, just to name a few that are still working and don't have settlements yet. And then we had a strike in Geneva, and I'll come back and talk about the Geneva strike in a little bit. So that's kind of the overall tone of bargaining, not everywhere, but in more places than we've seen in the past. We also know that a lot of places have been trying to work through collective bargaining virtually. There's been, when schools had to transition to remote instruction, that also meant that a lot of school board meetings switched to remote. That also meant that a lot of professional development and just opportunities for people to come together, including in a collective bargaining context, that there was a shift away from in-person to more remote bargaining. Now, most people I talk to don't like that. It changes the dynamic. It's hard to read the room. It's hard to really be able to have some of those sidebar conversations that are so critical to getting to a settlement. And even knowing that people are engaged, when you're in the room and some people speak through their body language, but it's kind of hard to deal with that when people are turning off their cameras, even if you've established some ground rules ahead of time. So there's been some remote bargaining. I think we've shifted back to in-person in most places as schools have reopened. Part of the issue that has fueled some of the tension and conflict has been frustration, as always, but I think it's even more true now because of all these different pressures of top-down initiatives. And some of that comes with, these are double-edged swords, like, for example, new federal funds. We have an significant influx of money through ESSER and the American Rescue Plan and other means coming into the state. But our members are frustrated that in far too few cases, they haven't, or in not enough cases, have they been given a full voice at the table in terms of how those funds are being used, even though the law does require engagement on that. And sometimes they're just initiatives and people feel like things are crammed down and added to their plates when their plates are already full. That's always been the case. There's always been some element of truth to that, but I think it's even more so now. We saw in the early stages of the pandemic, a lot of locals whose contracts were up in 20 rolled over. But at the end of 21, said we're not going to continue to do that. There was an agreement, between both sides to just continue rolling contracts. So we're back to more negotiation over the full agreement. And again, when you do that, there's more issues for potential, disagreement and conflict. We have had some locals that have had some success in bargaining language, either in MOUs or in their body of their collective bargaining agreement itself, related to limitations on remote learning. But that hasn't happened everywhere. These are working condition issues, but they're constantly changing, and not everywhere have we been able to address these issues through collective bargaining as much as we'd like. In some cases, you have issues related to sick days, particularly the use of sick leave in association with COVID or COVID quarantines. We had protection in federal law in the short term last year that allowed people who were required to quarantine because of COVID to be able to take days without dipping into their own sick leave. Most of those, in a few cases, there's been extension of that. Has been bargained, but these issues and pressures on use of leave have added to disputes between boards and local unions. Sick leave bank language being reopened and trying to figure out how best to take advantage of that. And again, the use of federal funds and the question about, who has a voice and how those funds are being used, particularly related to COVID and vaccine. And the question was asked ahead of time in the planning for this, how are vaccines playing into this? Well, first thing I'll say about vaccines is that in the K-12 space, I'm aware of only maybe 2 districts in the entire state. One of them where we have members, and another one where the Ohio Federation of Teachers represents members, where the board has made any kind of taken any kind of steps to move towards a vaccine mandate. Our position is that we're not necessarily opposed to a mandate, but we do believe that it's a subject of bargaining in terms of how it would be implemented. Given the political climate and given the fact that over 90% of our members are already vaccinated, it just hasn't been much of an issue, contrary to what you might see in higher education. So we haven't had disputes over vaccines per se. Now, until recently, when students weren't vaccinated, it added pressure and created a lot of consternation for a lot of members, knowing that there was still exposure in schools when you had large segments of the population that weren't protected by the vaccine. But it generally hasn't come up much as a subject of bargaining or as a subject of grievances or arbitration. One thing that has been an issue is from the beginning, we have employed a strategy of, where appropriate, supporting members and seeking ADA accommodations. And if they needed some kind of accommodation, and again, early stages of the pandemic, a lot of times it meant they were immunocompromised, or they had people at home who were especially vulnerable to COVID. And so an accommodation may have been to ask for an assignment to a remote learning assignment. Once we got to vaccination, a lot of that stuff became moot, but early on, those ADA issues were a lot more common. The other thing that it's not necessarily a bargaining issue, but it's definitely a source of a lot of frustration, is a sense of inconsistency in enforcing the rules that are in place. We got through last year, and by and large, kids did just fine, when it came to wearing masks. But we see that the more that masks have become a political football, a lot of administrators, understandably, have been reluctant to enforce the mask mandates that might be in place in different districts, especially if there are, parents or other groups that are pushing back. And that then creates a lot of conflict for our members. And I will say, our members, just like the general public, kind of, range across the spectrum in terms of how they personally feel about whether they should have to wear masks or not. But I think anytime you see inconsistency in carrying out policies, it creates tension. Sub shortages. I talked about that as being a real concern. We know that we have really tested contract language that's already in place. And in some cases, really put a spotlight on the need to have contract language where it didn't already exist to govern how do you handle it if you don't have enough substitute teachers or don't have enough substitute staff, but yet there's still a need to provide coverage. Do teachers get paid? How does that work? And so there have been grievances over some of those issues where there's language in contract and there's been disagreement about how that language is interpreted, or there's been bargaining over that where that language isn't there, or unions have felt that it needed to be strengthened. Issues involving notification when there is COVID exposure, when there are positive students, when there are quarantine issues, that has been a concern. And we know that particularly for our school nurses, they have felt really pressured by all the demands related to contact tracing. School nurses and principals have had an awful lot added to their plates because of the need for contact tracing, especially in places where there aren't masks required. And that has been a challenge. And then issues related to remote learning. So I mentioned that Geneva was on strike. Their strike was 2 days back at the beginning of November, November 3rd and 4th. They had a tentative agreement. There was a range of issues. It was negotiating their entire master agreement. Tentative agreement was rejected by their membership. They authorized a strike November 3rd, which is the day after election day. The strike began. Fortunately, they settled after the second day of the strike at the end of the day on November 4th. But there was one issue that drove that strike in Geneva, and that was the question about synchronous teaching. If you have some students who are learning remotely, you have other students who are learning in the classroom, what the Geneva Area Teachers Association did is they drew a line in the sand and said, we are not going to agree to teach both students synchronously, simultaneously. Instead, we need to come up with a plan so that we give our remote students the attention that they deserve. We give our in-class students the attention that they deserve. We don't do a disservice to both of those groups of students by essentially dividing the attention of the teacher. Again, at the same time, when they're trying to teach a group of kids in class and out of class at the same time. They had tremendous support from across the community, and they ended up prevailing on that issue, and they got language in their contract that they were seeking on that issue. So those have all been part of the mix there. Also addressing issues like calamity days and teacher evaluation have been part of it. Last thing I'll just say, and we'll open it up for questions. As far as grievances and arbitrations, there's been some grievance and grievance meetings and some arbitrations that have been handled remotely. I think they're shifting back to in person. It does make things more complicated when that's happening. As far as the volume of grievances, I don't know that these issues are leading to more grievances, but I think given the overall tenor and tone of what's happening, some of our labor relations consultants are saying that they're seeing more grievances in their locals. I think because members are just paying closer attention to the language of the contract, not necessarily because of new issues that are arising. So last thing that I'll say is just to kind of take a step back and understand where we are and what this means in terms of the context of our times and the labor movement. First off, there continue to be organized, well-funded, coordinated, far-reaching attacks on OEA and on all unions, especially public sector unions, in the aftermath of the Janus case, funded by groups like the Freedom Foundation that are appealing directly to members to say, hey, you can give yourself a raise by turning down your membership and choosing not to join or dropping your membership in the union. We have seen that. We've seen the impact of that. I will say, though, that while we have seen a slight uptick in the number of membership drops, that is more than made up for, many times more than made up for, if you look at the number of new members that we have gained, especially in the past year. So our overall membership, active membership, is like within a fraction of 1%, either just above or just below where it was this time last year. So those efforts don't seem to be really having much impact. And I think a lot of that is because people are recognizing the value of belonging to a union. We see that public support for labor unions is at the highest level that we've seen since the 1960s. A lot of you are familiar with Striketober and really just the extraordinary number of strikes, mostly in the private sector, that have happened this year. And, you know, I think there's a sense that given the dynamics of the labor market, that workers have leverage that they haven't necessarily had in the past. And then, of course, inflationary pressures, you know, create even more demand for fair compensation settlements at the bargaining table. So, you know, that's all happening. If there is a pressure on our membership, what we're watching is a pretty extraordinary number of unfilled positions, given, you know, just the vacancy rate. And again, it's all tied to the shortages that we talked about before, but that does show up in a number of bargaining unit positions that are just simply unfilled right now because we're having a hard time, you know, finding people for those positions. So I will stop there, but I will be happy to respond to any questions that anybody has.
I do. And Scott, thank you very much for accepting our invitation, particularly since I tried to get somebody else and they didn't even answer me. So the fact that you even answered puts you one step above the chairman of the NLRB, and I thank you for that. I'm curious, you were talking about some of the negotiations that have been contentious. Is there some sort of a commonality as to what the issues are that were the basis for the contentiousness? I'm not sure if it would be economic. Was it related to COVID? Is it related to something else?
Yeah, like I said, every situation is a little bit different. In some cases, probably more often than not, there are economic issues that are driving contentious negotiations. You know, coming out of the Great Recession of 10 years ago, or going all the way back to 2008, but again, for us, there's kind of a delayed impact of the recession, you know, in terms of how schools were funded. We had locals all over the state that took year after year of, you know, base freezes, in some cases step freezes, in some cases even negotiated contracts that reduced the level of compensation because districts were facing such challenging economic times, and a lot of that was because of underfunding of our schools. Remember, in 2011, public education was cut by $1.9 billion in John Kasich's first year as governor. So that really had an impact over a period of time. And now that funding is at a much better level than it's been in a long time, you know, the state's running a surplus. We saw healthy increases in state aid. We've seen pretty good passage rates for local levies. And then we've got this influx of federal dollars. A lot of people are going to the table and saying, hey, we sacrificed all those years that the district said they didn't have the resources. Now that you have the resources, you're not willing to negotiate with us to make sure that we're adequately compensated. And in some cases, it's an expectation to make up for some of those concessions and losses over the years. So if there's one thing that's more common than anything else, it's probably that issue. But that's not necessarily the case everywhere. In some cases, it's working condition issues related to, you know, the pressures connected to COVID or staff shortages. In some cases, it's about health insurance and again, one thing that we know about health insurance, while overall healthcare costs, are always trending upward, some districts are in better positions than other districts when it comes to their own claims and the bottom line that they're facing. So so it really kind of varies, but I think that economic reality and looking at it over the arc of the last 10 years, and then of course now when we're in a period of higher inflation, hopefully it's not going to be lasting as a long-term trend, but that certainly adds to the pressure as well.
Thank you. If nobody else is going to ask, I've got another one, if you don't mind.
Go for it.
You had a lot in your presentation, so it sparked some questions in my own mind. You mentioned that 90% of the teaching workforce is vaccinated, which is an impressive number compared to the general population as well as other professions. But it also sounds like there's room for improvement. Is there any kind of concerted effort by the OEA to either encourage or assist the remaining 10% to get vaccinated, or have you basically reached your top out point in vaccination rates where they are?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I will say that from the very beginning, we have been very open about encouraging anyone and everyone who doesn't have a medical reason for not being vaccinated to go ahead and get vaccinated. We advocated successfully for teachers to be and other school personnel to be included in that early wave, before a lot of other people in the general public, as essential workers. And the governor and others recognize that in order for schools to be open for in-person instruction, you had to vaccinate staff, and then there was an expectation that every district open once everybody had the opportunity to be vaccinated. So we got to that number pretty quickly, and part of it too was because vaccinations were provided district by district, and in a lot of cases on site, where people had space and time provided to them to do that. We continue to advocate for that. We continue to encourage people to be boosted. We're looking at, as we are planning our own events, and we've gone back and forth in terms of some of our internal activities being remote versus being in person, as we move back to in-person events, putting more emphasis on the need to be vaccinated in order to attend those events. But I think you get to a certain point where there is a certain part of the population that is just resistant. I think we've got most of the people who were reluctant, but there are some people that are openly resistant. And our membership is not altogether different than the makeup of the state as a whole. For some people, it's about politics, and they're pretty set on their belief that they don't want to be required to do it, and so we're limited in what we can do. And like I said, employers haven't been pushing this, and the legislature has made it pretty clear they're resistant to mandates. So we'll see where it goes, but we're hoping that we continue to get more people vaccinated, but we may have hit a bit of a plateau.
Yeah, the inconsistency that you mentioned in enforcement in some places, is there a reason for that? Is there some sort of fear of either a parental or a student or an employee backlash if they really did enforce consistently?
Yeah, I think some of it has to do with the dynamics, and if you we all saw what happened this past fall in terms of local school board meetings, not everywhere, but in a lot of communities where they were ground zero for these culture war battles. And I think that certainly has an impact, has a trickle down effect in terms of how policies are going to be enforced in schools. So maybe there's a mandate in place, but knowing that there's a lot of resistance to that mandate, there may be some reluctance on the part of some school administrators to fully enforce it, because hey, how do we how do we deal with this resistance or pushback? I think there's also, there's a certain reality that a lot of people just are tired of having to deal with this. We all are experiencing COVID fatigue, and I think, unfortunately, that COVID fatigue is partially responsible for extending the pandemic, because not enough people are taking the precautions that they need. And we've been saying all along, you want schools to be open for in-person instruction, do the things that are necessary to prevent, the spread of the virus. And then some of it's just human nature. I mean, I can say, as somebody who spent 30 years in education, and I remember being in some pretty intense faculty meeting debates about how we enforce hat rules and how we enforce hoodies and how we enforce, other kinds of things. They're just some issues. It's just people have different, perspectives, and that inconsistency is there, but it's frustrating. It's always been a point of frustration.
Scott.
Yeah,
Oh, I'm
go ahead.
sorry, George.
Hey, Jack.
No, please, I've been monopolizing it. Go ahead.
Scott, I was wondering, in the last year and a half, have you seen an increase in the use of the local labor management committees and increase in dialogue between the union reps and the local management in the localities?
I have not heard, and there may be other people here who could speak to that in their own personal experience. I know that long term, we've seen more and more locals that have bargained labor management committee structures into their contracts. I know in my local we had one, and I think it worked really pretty well. And we have places like Lakewood, for example, that have really stood out in terms of using labor management committees to informally work through conflicts so that it doesn't, fall into the formal grievance process. But I don't know, and my suspicion is that whatever growth or change was happening in that regard probably got interrupted by the pandemic, and it's disrupted everything, and it's probably made it hard to make more progress. But if ever there was a time that you wanted well-functioning labor management committees, it was in working through these COVID issues and working through these staff shortage issues and things like that. But I have not heard, based on the reports from my staff, really one way or the other, whether that's been increasing or decreasing as far as prevalence. And I don't know if anybody else, OEA folks on the call, have any other perspective on that.
Thanks, Scott.
Yeah, great question, Jack. Greg, I see you have a question.
Yeah, I raised my hand because I got a message that said that the host muted me. So I don't know what she has against me. But you mentioned the synchronous teaching issue in Geneva, and I was just curious. The way I've run into it is that I haven't run into it. It seems as if most of the schools that I've encountered through one source or another have divided the online and in-class service, and some of them even stopped the online entirely. Is it an issue that is really contentious anywhere else, or was this just a one-off?
Well, it hasn't come up in a lot of places in the context of bargaining. The teachers there, were really insistent that had to be addressed. Ironically, it was a relatively small number of people in terms of students that were affected by this, who were remote learners. And there's really no reason that it should have gone to this point, but they just couldn't get agreement from the administration to that it should be a subject of bargaining, and that it should be in their contract. But the issue of synchronous instruction for remote and in-person learners was a huge issue everywhere last year. When we saw districts that were in hybrid settings, when we saw larger numbers of students that were being, quarantined or expected to learn remotely. And the experience was nearly universal. I've not met a single teacher, and this is not just in Ohio, this is nationally as well, that believed that this synchronous simultaneous instruction was effective. It stresses teachers out, and it shortchanges kids in both things. So you are right. A lot of districts just chose not to offer remote learning at all as an option this year. And some districts that have been providing remote learning as an option have essentially a dedicated academy or a dedicated strand, and they have dedicated staff who are serving those students. And in those kinds of cases, it seems that it works pretty well. Overall, I will also say that we had a forced experiment with remote learning, and what I hear from members, and I think the data bear that out in terms of, if you look at the assessment that has been done, is that remote learning, except for a pretty small segment of the population, just isn't an effective way to provide instruction to students. That there really isn't a substitute for the kind of connection that teachers provide in the classroom. And but we also know that there are some kids that's the only option that they have, and a lot of districts are trying to provide choices for their families. If the district's going to be doing that, we have had locals like in Geneva, and last year we actually had a strike over a similar issue in Gahanna outside of Columbus, where they've said, let's have language in the contract to really delineate what the responsibilities are for teachers, and to be clear that if you're responsible for teaching remote learners, you're not doing that at the same time that you're teaching in-person learners.
Thank you. Okay. Anyone else? We have Scott here for the next minute.
Any of my OEA colleagues want to take issue with anything I said? Correct me for the record.
Okay. All right. Well,
Yeah,
thanks. You got another one, George?
No, just one last question, because he's a social studies teacher, and I got to believe that he's, to the extent that there's any kind of parental, some might call it involvement, others might call, I'm one of them, into some of the things you're trying to teach kids, particularly trying to teach them things that maybe they haven't been taught before. How much of that has been a real issue for your people, or is it more of just something that gets a lot of national attention, but is really a rare exception?
That's a really good question. And actually, I have heard anecdotally, and some of this is being pushed by certain extremist outside groups, where there are like standard questionnaires that parents are being encouraged to use as a communication tool with teachers to say, hey, here are all those parameters, things you can and can't do. And before you bring up any of these topics, there's a long list of topics, and you have to call me to get my permission first. I think it's relatively rare, but it is something that's popped up from time to time. I think that the bigger concern is more of the threat. Kind of, it's a dark cloud hanging over a lot of people's heads, particularly if this does end up being legislated. And there are all these sanctions in House Bill 327 that if you teach or if you're determined to be promoting these divisive concepts, that could cost you your license, that could cost your school district its funding. And I think, certainly all the concerns that we have about teacher shortage to begin with, I believe would have a real chilling effect in getting more people to go into education, particularly in areas like mine and high school level social studies. The reality is that our teachers across the state teach the state standards. They teach their board adopted curriculums. They teach the way that they're trained to teach. They teach in a balanced way. They're doing all they can to teach the truth, to give students the opportunity to have a well-rounded education. And also to understand that you learn from your mistakes in order to do better. And I think that's the same is true as a country. I went into social studies education because I wanted to instill in my students the critical thinking skills to be good citizens. And so I believe that you learn from all the good, bad, and ugly from our history in order to be better. It's about making our country better. And I think this debate has been interesting. I think a lot of it has been theoretical, but we'll see what happens. We're doing all we can to stop that legislation from being passed. And then where there have been, shifts in power at local school boards, really monitoring to make sure that we're advocating for the legal rights of our members.
Thank you.
Okay, anybody else? Well, thanks very much, Scott. I wish I had a virtual mug to give you, but you have to virtually accept it. Appreciate you being there and being there. This is now the second time that you visited with us, and we have to thank you and the OEA. They've been really tremendous supporters of our organization, and I want to thank all of your members that are here too, that have been regularly supporting our local organization. I have been corrected while you were speaking about our next meetings. They are on March 30th and May 25th. I had them reversed, but it's March 30th, it's not the last day of the month, but March 30th and May 25th. We still don't know if they're going to be in person or virtual, but keep an eye on your emails from us, from Mary Alice, from LERA. Get on the website and register, so that you don't have to wait for an invitation to attend the next meeting. You can register right away as soon as the notice comes out. And also, don't forget your password, and have to have it reset the way I do every time. So I have to try to remember to do that. Okay. Anybody have anything more to say before we adjourn? Anyone else? Questions? Diatribes?
Have a good evening, everyone.
Thank you all.
Thanks, Scott. Take care.
Evening
all.
all.
Thank
Good
you,
to see you all.
President.
Thank you,
for the
Scott.
opportunity.
Thank you, Mary Alice.